So next up we have Andrea from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Andrea led the workshop yesterday, the Annex IV workshop, and she'll be talking about the international collaboration to investigate the environmental effects of wave and tidal devices.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks very much to the organizers and the chance to be here to talk to you about Annex IV, which is an international collaboration to investigate environmental effects of wave and energy devices. I'm not talking permitting consenting processes at all, but I'm sort of hoping that you can see that the work we're doing is going to help with these processes as they go along. I want to acknowledge two of my co-authors who are here, Luke Hanna from my lab, Jocelyn Brown-Saraceno from U.S. Department of Energy, as well as Hoyt Batty from DOE. So we're all here because we know why marine energy is important, but it's important, we must acknowledge that stakeholders still have concerns. And those concerns arise from many of the reasons we've just heard, but think about the fact these are new technologies. We don't understand if they have potential harm. These are ocean spaces that are already being used by other users. We don't know much about these particular places where we're trying to put in tidal and wave energy because they're just not places that oceanographers like me ever want to put their equipment. And we have a lot of marine species worldwide that are already under stress. So there's a reason why stakeholders can have concerns. And this tends to translate into regulatory consenting processes that focus on these areas where there is a lot of uncertainty and perhaps, therefore, high risk to animals, to habitats, etc. The best thing we think that can be done is really try to work collectively on bringing together the information we have scientifically, economically, socially, etc., and sharing that information so we're not reinventing the wheels. And we have this opportunity to do this internationally. Annex IV is a concept in sharing information and analyses internationally. The Ocean Energy Systems, which is a group of 21 nations interested in marine energy development, come together and do various collaborative projects, including Annex IV, which was approved in 2009. The U.S. proposed it, therefore gets to lead it. Department of Energy is the lead, along with some other agencies, and we are very fortunate in my laboratory to get to implement it. We had 7 nations in the first phase of Annex IV, which ran from 2010 to 2013. That's pretty much what I'm going to talk to you about today, and then where we're going in the future. The purpose and the components of Annex IV, the purpose really was for governments to be able to facilitate and oversee the development of the marine energy sector. But also, Annex IV tries to ensure that all existing information on environmental effects is captured and shared so no one's reinventing the wheel. This first phase of Annex IV had basically 2 major outcomes. The first is information is captured from project sites. Anybody who's had a device in the water worldwide, we've done some monitoring for environmental effects. We've tried to capture that information. We've also captured ongoing aspects of ongoing research studies, as well as the traditional scientific papers, reports, and all that. And that's captured on our online database known as TEFIS, and a lot of you probably, hopefully, picked up our cute little cards, so you can find that pretty easily. The other part of Annex IV, we wrote a report that did analyses on 3 what we considered high risk, due to high uncertainty interactions, and for which not enough information existed. The first was the interaction of marine animals with tidal turbine blades, things like collision and evasion, etc. The second had to do with the effects of underwater noise from wave and tidal devices on marine animals. And the third analysis looked at effects on the physical systems due to change in flow and waves from devices being in the water, and also taking that energy out of the water. This is our TEFIS website, very simple URL there. We hope you'll go and visit it. And in addition to it's just been relaunched actually with sort of a new design and new capabilities. And besides being able to search for information in a very standardized kind of format, if there's any geospatial tagging or any of the projects and research studies worldwide, you can pick them off the familiar Google map, get to them that way as well. But what I want to do the rest of this time is talk to you a little bit about the 3 so-called case studies analysis we did. If you're a purist, they're not case studies at all, but that's what we call them. And they're a very standardized way of going about looking at publicly available information and trying to pull it together. I just want to very briefly talk about some of the lines of evidence we used, some of the conclusions we reached, and some of the data gaps and research needs for these three analysis areas. Love to go into more detail, but we don't have time. So in terms of the first case study, the interaction of marine animals with turbine blades, we relied first of all on any field studies work done. And some of the key ones obviously was information out of Strangford Lock from the MCT CGen turbine, observations around a fish tidal turbine in coastal Maine in the US, and Gail Zalewski will be talking more about that this afternoon. There were fish fed through a turbine on the Mississippi River, not in a hydro dam, but an in-stream turbine, and video observations of fish around an open hydro turbine in EMEC, and measurements done acoustically by the Verdant company around some turbines in the East River of New York. There's also been laboratory experiments carried out in two different flume settings, putting a turbine in the flume and letting fish, introducing fish into the turbine, shall we say, to see how they do with passage, and a little bit about their behavior around the turbines. There's also been a number of modeling studies. Some of the key ones was done here by SAMS, looking at herring and porpoise encounter models around tidal turbines around Scotland. And my laboratory with Andrea National Laboratories had the opportunity to do some modeling of what would happen to one of our highly endangered killer whales if it were struck by a tidal turbine. This is the kind of information we pulled together for this particular one, and there's analogous information for the other case studies. In this case, the conclusions and data gaps that we were able to identify, to date, there's no evidence that direct interaction to any of these marine animals from a tidal turbine blade is going to be really significant based on what's been in the water so far. However, it's important to note that we can't really tell whether animals attracted to turbines may up that risk if we haven't had enough in the water. And it's also important to note that the data collected have been from short-term deployments, usually one or a very small number of devices, and we don't entirely know how that may scale up to many, many more devices. So the monitoring data needs are really pretty obvious. We need a lot more monitoring around single turbines, around multi-turbine arrays as we get there. We also need to have more laboratory studies of animals interacting with turbines so we can really understand those kinds of behavioral aspects, how an animal will deal with the turbine. These will largely have to be fish studies, certainly in our country, and I suspect worldwide. No one's going to experiment with marine mammals. And we really need to really up our game in modeling. We need to look at biological aspects, but also the physical aspects of the way that animals may approach a turbine, the ambient waters, the turbines, etc. Okay, now moving to our next case study, the effect of underwater noise on animals. I'm not going to show you the lines of evidence. There's many, many of them, and they're all incomplete. We have little pictures of how the sound from turbines or wave devices, what they sound like in terms of both amplitude and frequency, but they're really, really limited. So what we really conclude, and then almost nothing to do with direct observation of animals around turbines. In fact, really nothing. So really there's insufficient information to really reach conclusions at this point. So there's a lot of needs. We've learned bits, but what we really need is to ensure that there are field deployments, particularly studies ahead of putting the turbines in the water. So we really measure the ambient sound in a water body, and we understand how sound propagates in that water body. So once the turbine or the WEC is put in, we can measure the actual signal from that device, and also try to sort out the marginal way in which an animal may change its behavior. We need to know how the animals are behaving naturally, then how they're behaving once there's the sound of the device put into place. We need to understand dose response relationships, how animals respond to sound. Again, this has to be done in the laboratory, largely with fish. It's very hard to sort these things out in the field. There's so much other signal going on. And we have to determine, once we get multiple devices in the water, we've measured the sound from a few devices, maybe we'll understand how animals act. But how does that look when there's many devices? Is the sound additive? Is it multiplicative? We need to understand the sound propagation potential within water bodies, and we really need to look at a range of devices, of both tidal and turbine devices, not only the device itself, but the balance of station. What about the change in flow noise around foundations? How do mooring lines twang? What about anchoring systems, etc.? We really know so little in this area, and yet we really believe, particularly with marine mammals, maybe some fish, this may be a really key factor in how they respond, both if there is any kind of a really upset to the animals, but also are these signals sufficient to keep them away from the devices and out of danger. The third case study we looked at was effects on physical systems, both change it by putting tidal turbines or wave devices in. How do we change the flow in an estuary or a bay, or how do we change the way the waves operate? And all of these studies are modeling studies. There really is virtually nothing that's been done in the field, for good reason. But none of these modeling studies are validated, and we really need field measurements to validate these studies. But it's really a challenge because of these huge temporal and spatial scales. We need to take turbulence into account. The effects of most models will take sort of an idealized marine energy device or just a sort of a placeholder for energy removal. We really need to look at how individual WECs and tidal turbines interact in the flow field. We also need to think about what happens right near field, as Graham said earlier. What is the near field? What's happening right there? What's happening further afield? Right now, we have no reason to believe from the modeling studies there's going to be much in the way of measurable change right close to a turbine or a WEC. We don't know about once you build out and can you start to affect a far field. Is there such a thing as a tipping point at which a water body will begin to actually show breakdown? Some of the modeling studies put in many turbines or WECs, probably more than anyone would ever consent, but we still don't know if there's likely to be effects. And finally, there's great need to measure turbulence and inflow conditions in order to design the right kind of turbine, operate it correctly, but we also need this information in order to interpret environmental effects. So that's a really key place to be working with the sort of the other end of the development process, the resource characterization, and the engineers designing the systems. Okay, many of you sat through the workshop with us yesterday. Thank you very much. For those of you that didn't, just a quick overview of what we talked about. We tried to focus on 4 interactions with marine animals that we think have high uncertainty and therefore may be disrupting consenting processes at this point. We looked at interactions with blades and animals, collision and evasion. We looked at attraction of animals to devices, avoidance barrier effects, and mooring lines. And just a few sort of overarching truisms, none of which are technical exactly. But we realized that it was really a consensus that monitoring programs that are really can get at some of this uncertainty, perhaps take some of the risk off the table, that are also affordable, really are going to depend heavily on having good baseline assessments of the water bodies, the animals, the habitats ahead of time. And in most cases, we don't have those. And we probably need them at a broader scale than the developers can actually carry out themselves. We also need, parallel with the early deployments and monitoring programs, we need good research studies that will help us understand these risks so that we can then develop appropriate follow-up monitoring programs and mitigation strategies. We did decide that there is a possibility of putting an integrated package of instruments together to look at blade interactions like collision and evasion, but it's going to be very costly. And this obviously is an issue. Although working internationally has tremendous advantage, we have to recognize and acknowledge that there are regulatory consenting differences among countries, and this could affect how monitoring programs are developed. In fact, it will. The differences are important, but they're probably not as important as working together to try to figure out the right stuff. There's going to be a report from the workshop, and I'll be sure that everybody who signed up for this conference does get a copy. Okay, back to Annex IV, the future. We had an experts workshop in Dublin in 2012, and that and consulting with the other OES nations, it became clear there's still a lot that needs to be done. When Annex IV started in 2010, we really believed by 2014 we'd have a lot of devices in the water, lots of monitoring data, and we would have solved all these problems. But I think the fact that we're all here today shows we haven't actually. So the decision was made to continue. And Annex IV has was reauthorized for another 3 years, starting in 2014 through 2016. We will be, the scope of that, and it is what we're calling phase 2, will continue to do what we've been doing, collecting information worldwide. And I have a group of analysts in all the countries involved, many of whom are here today, which is great. We're all going to have lunch tomorrow, by the way. But we also are really going to try to make Annex IV more of a collaborative commons for the research community, the developers, stakeholders, and regulators. We'll be doing this with a series of online tools. After all, we can't all travel together all the time. Webinars, online forums, social media. Like us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, no kidding. And in fact, our next environmental webinar will be May 19th, featuring 2 of your key Scottish researchers. Again, we'll get an announcement out to all of you on that shortly. We'll also be trying to engage more scientists internationally to help us with these analyses, and we will continue to support international conferences. Right now we have 11 nations involved in phase 2 and growing, and so that's really exciting, up from 7 in the last phase. And that's it. I want to thank you for hanging in with me, but I especially need to acknowledge everyone from our research team. An unbelievable number of people have helped us. The Wave Center in Portugal, University of Plymouth Marine Lab, Aquaterra have really been instrumental in helping collect information worldwide, because it's not that easy. We've had lots of help, obviously, from the Department of Energy and Annex IV nations, but really, the researchers and developers worldwide have really cooperated with us, is what's made this possible, and we hope that that will continue. Thank you. My God, time left.
Thanks, Andrea.
Can I take a question, or maybe there's no question?
Yeah, we actually do have a little bit of time, because the session at 10:50 to 10:30 by Mr. Wade is cancelled, so we can take a couple of questions.
Are there any questions? No. It's okay, we're still waking up. We'll be talking soon. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. It's interesting from my perspective to see the work that you're doing. You're quite blinkered, I think, in Scotland in terms of what's happening in the rest of the world, and the fact that somebody's synthesising all the global work that's being done into one place is very interesting to us. We'll be checking out the website again, I think, it's a new look.